A common saying is that you may not be interested in politics, but politics is interested in you. Obviously, this video is not about politics, but the general idea still applies. We are subject to cultural forces that are larger than ourselves, and as a consequence, these forces can harm people who aren't in positions of power, as the modern satanic panic demonstrated. I mention positions of power specifically because Christians who are in positions of power and influence, like talk show hosts and positions of authority within the church, were able to utilize these things to drum up fear that led to the lives of those without power and influence being ruined. This sort of thing is clearly an exercise of power and authority, even if those who wield the power may not fully understand the kind of damage they are inflicting. When given the opportunity, they created a system of injustice that victimized the defenseless with the claims that they were part of some grossly immoral, demonic cult, and glorified those that were being portrayed as serving Yahweh, but were personally benefiting from the misuse of their authority. By the way, I will use the term Christian a lot in this video, and it is used for the sake of simplicity, with the understanding that Christians are not a monolith, and not all Christians hold harmful beliefs to be true. Targeting those who practice witchcraft is not something that is limited to Christianity or even Abrahamic religion, but within the Western world it is primarily Christians who do this. Naturally, the Satanic Panic, as well as older examples of persecution like the Salem witch trials, illustrate how religion in particular can act as a cultural force that brings out the worst in people. Additionally, since media organizations sometimes mischaracterize the facts or mislead people, this has led certain people to engage with a conspiracy theory mindset, in which these people choose to believe information which reinforces their biases and prior beliefs. This creates a situation in which certain people who live in echo chambers filled with conspiracy theories can easily have their religious beliefs exploited in a way that creates a large cultural force similar to the Satanic Panic. A prime target for religious manipulators in positions of power are those that practice sorcery or witchcraft, or those who otherwise fail to conform to Christian doctrine. In this context, if those who don't conform are complacent and unable to provide a persuasive defense for their actions, the villainization of the nonconformists will go unchallenged. Remember, the baseless accusations made during the Satanic Panic had to be tried in the court of public opinion as well in actual courts. Which brings us to the conclusion that it is necessary to defend nonconformist positions. A particularly important one, in my assessment at least, is the inherent neutrality of sorcery. Sorcery itself is inherently neutral because moral weight can only relate to sorcery as a result of how it's applied, rather than as a fundamental aspect of its nature. I use the term sorcery because the term witchcraft may have some confusion because it can refer to two things simultaneously, the belief system itself and the act of practicing things like ritual magic. People who make the claim that sorcery relies upon demons never meet the burden of proof for that claim. They never provide conclusive proof that demons directly cause sorcery to work, because they were not brought to that conclusion by flawless reasoning and proof. It is important to point out that the Bible consistently says that sorcery is immoral, rather than that all sorcery is derived from demons. The earlier biblical perspective offers a weaker rhetorical position than the modern Christian position that sorcery is demonic. The reason why the modern position is stronger in a polemic sense is because it shifts the portrayal of sorcery from a moral failing that Yahweh dislikes to a more inherently dangerous situation in which you are allying yourself with demonic forces that are proactively evil and may possess you as a result. With the older biblical argument, one could simply reject the flawed premise that Yahweh has the ultimate moral authority, and the conclusion that sorcery is inherently immoral would collapse as a result. The problem that Christians face is that they can never find conclusive proof that Yahweh exists and that he wields ultimate moral authority. Naturally, these 2 points need to be inarguable for the morality argument to hold up to scrutiny. Naturally, there is always a Christian rebuttal. Those who reject the alleged moral authority of Yahweh are then challenged to justify the moral standard that they use. This challenge is not easy for the average person to defend because it is difficult to find justification for moral standards due to the is-ought divide articulated by David Hume. The is-ought divide is the issue where you ultimately can't justify what you morally ought to do from simple facts. This means that you are left with your subjective moral evaluation rather than the objective morality that many Christians claim to have. Thankfully, not even Christians can offer a solution for the is-ought divide, which means that you both have to rely on subjective moral valuation. Yet this does not mean that all subjective moral valuations are equal, because some lead to poor consequences that violate autonomy, like oppression, subjugation, and persecution, as Christianity has historically done. Not all moral valuations are equally coherent either. Some are found to be incoherent on close inspection, and some lack sufficient logical justification even within their own frameworks. Christians will make the rhetorical move to claim that without objective morality, we will just devolve into moral relativism, and this is clearly not true. We can use coherence, consequences, and justification to judge how different subjective moral perspectives rank in comparison to each other. All you really have to do is demonstrate that your subjective valuations are better than your opponent, and the doctrine of eternal conscious torment makes this fairly easy, especially since it is almost always presupposed that Yahweh is justified in inflicting this kind of torture. The person who is not bound to the Bible has an overall advantage because they have less moral claims that they need to defend. This is important to highlight because the Bible contains various examples of Yahweh's behavior being quite barbaric and essentially indefensible by today's moral standards. An example of this is the decision to drown most of humanity and the animals because of perceived continued moral failure on the part of humanity. Another example is Yahweh's punishment of Achan because Achan took things that allegedly he wasn't supposed to have. The consequence of this was that Achan and his family were stoned and then burned along with Achan's animals, never mind the fact that Achan's family and his animals were not responsible for doing anything wrong. We know that Christian views about sorcery are the result of the political control and social regulation of ancient Israel society. We can contrast this to a more rigorous modern understanding of the paranormal derived from the scientific study of it. This is the difference between adherence to dogma in service of faith versus deriving conclusions from the best evidence available in service to a truth beyond the scope of Christianity. The modern Christian portrayal of sorcery is ultimately a matter of faith rather than a matter of fact independent of personal belief. Additionally, the Christian perspective is generally that since sorcery does not come from Yahweh, it is an illegitimate and unauthorized source of spiritual power. This causes some interesting theological issues because the modern view of Yahweh is that all things are ultimately contingent upon him. If we treat this perspective as somewhat coherent, then it would mean that Yahweh created a mechanism or pathway that allows sorcery to function, while also consistently saying that you should not use sorcery because it's immoral. In Micah 5:12, it's clear that Yahweh has the motivation and intention to stop witchcraft and soothsaying, which I will refer to as divination. This is a problem because there is no evidence that Yahweh followed through with this goal in the Bible or in real life. The first common rebuttal is that this is an unfulfilled prophecy and that Yahweh is still going to fulfill it sometime. The problem with this rebuttal is that it relies on circular reasoning. The perspective of the person who makes this rebuttal is that Yahweh is going to do this, and the reason that we know that this is actually going to happen because Yahweh is going to do this. This argument relies on an unfalsifiable claim, which puts it beyond the scope of rational discourse and in the realm of irrational discourse. The next rebuttal is the claim that the prophecy is somehow conditional and that since the condition was not met for some reason, the prophecy was not fulfilled. This claim is incoherent with the verse in question because the verse is clear that there is definitely going to be a future action. Additionally, this rebuttal relies on an unfalsifiable claim beyond the scope of rational discourse. The final rebuttal is the claim that Yahweh is permitting sorcery and divination to continue for some undefined reason. If Yahweh acknowledges that these things are immoral and still chooses to allow them to occur, then Yahweh is violating and undermining his own moral position by being complicit through inaction. Again, we also run into a coherence problem because the verse is explicit that Yahweh is declaring that he is definitely going to prevent sorcery and divination from continuing. Yet another issue is that the rebuttal position requires more assumptions, less parsimony, and is less likely to be true as a result. So we have two positions. The first is position A, which requires three assumptions. Yahweh exists as a real being rather than just a literary creation. Yahweh spoke through divine revelation to talk about witchcraft and divination in Micah 5:12. Yahweh did not follow through with the prophesied action, and this explains the lack of a specific action that stopped sorcery and divination from occurring. In comparison, position B requires no assumptions and is the following. No conclusive proof exists that supports Yahweh's existence. The absence of proof for Yahweh's existence potentially explains the absence of a specific action that stops sorcery and divination from continuing because Yahweh might not exist in the first place. Applying Occam's razor, we find that position B is more parsimonious, requires zero assumptions, and is therefore more likely to be true than position A. Next, let's grant some things for the sake of argument. Let's say that Yahweh exists, Christianity is correct in its portrayal that sorcery is outside of Yahweh's will, and let's also say that the Bible is correct and consistent in its perspective that Yahweh has zero tolerance for sorcery. The conclusion that we reach is that we have incoherent premises because something that is intolerable to Yahweh's will still exists. We've already established the positions that rely on Yahweh's existence to attempt to resolve this incoherence are less likely to be true than the alternative. In an attempt to maintain coherence, Christians must redefine zero tolerance. The rebuttal is obvious. Yahweh tolerates sorcery for some undefined reason, and it is assumed that this is a good reason rather than a bad one. The obvious problem is presupposing that Yahweh has a reason for tolerating sorcery. On this note, it is worth considering the biblical story of Saul and the Witch of Endor. The Witch of Endor is not punished by Yahweh for her action of summoning the spirit of the prophet Samuel. No reason is given as to why she isn't punished either. This is an obvious problem because if Yahweh truly holds the position that you should not allow a witch to live, as Exodus 22:18 clearly states, then Yahweh should at the very least follow his own morality-based command and punish her. This highlights the fact that since Yahweh's actions and words do not match, he fails to meet his own moral standards. Naturally, if you see someone failing to uphold their own moral standards, you can infer that these standards are not their highest priority. Therefore, Yahweh's supposed moral authority collapses as a result. It has been observed that there is a functional similarity between sorcery and prayer, in that both are used by humans to achieve results. The key point here is this functional similarity, because some will try to argue that prayer requires a mutual relationship with God. This argument does not address the functional similarity, but rather presupposes the internal logic to be accurate in order to use circular reasoning to superficially address the issue with rhetorical framing. This functional similarity issue is a real problem for Christians because it suggests that there is only an artificial cultural distinction between sorcery and prayer. If paranormal forces exist, then there must be a fundamental mechanism that allows for their existence. Since prayer and sorcery are paranormal forces, it is likely that they are both derived from the same fundamental mechanism. Some will claim that prayer and sorcery must be derived from two separate fundamental mechanisms. However, if we use Occam's razor, we know that the two-mechanism explanation is less likely to be true because it introduces greater complexity, less parsimony, and another assumption. We know that sorcery and prayer both require human initiation for any results to occur, so we can conclude that sorcery and prayer are two different things that describe the interaction between human initiation and the fundamental mechanism that allows paranormal forces to exist. The connotations associated with these two things are a result of culture rather than a reflection of the fundamental mechanism. Additionally, initiating paranormal results has no inherent moral weight, just as other fundamental forces like chemical bonds have no inherent moral weight. Moral weight can only be created by the intent and/or consequences of the interaction in question. Naturally, some people will take issue from these conclusions because they contradict Christian dogma. However, Christian dogma can't offer an alternative explanation that is more logically supported because it must rely on assertions and fallacies like circular reasoning and appeal to authority in order to maintain coherence with the internal logic of Christianity. As an example, Christianity relies on the biblical view that asserts sorcery is inherently immoral, but it is impossible to prove the claim of inherent immorality. Christians can also assert that the Bible is divinely inspired and use the appeal to authority fallacy in order to try to convince you that you should obey Yahweh because he is supposedly the ultimate authority. If a prayer is answered in a way that can't have a mundane explanation, then all we really know is that there must be a mechanism that allows for such a thing to occur. Additionally, it is necessary to use circular reasoning for this argument to state that things in the Bible are true because the Bible says that they are. There is a lack of definite causal connection between the initiation of prayer and a God intervening to answer the prayer. The assumption that Christians make is that there is a being that we would recognize as Yahweh that answers the prayers. The conclusion that Yahweh answers the prayers is not reached by the identification of a causal connection, but through faith instead. I've already made a video where I talk about the flaw in logic that Christians use to come to the conclusion that psychic powers are demonic. By the way, everything that I've said about a mechanism that allows paranormal effects to occur applies equally to sorcery and psychic powers. Christians will typically start out by asserting or presupposing that sorcery comes from the demonic. There is usually an accompanying appeal to ignorance in the statement that you can't tell for sure that sorcery comes from human psychic ability. Their arguments are structured in such a way that they are logically flawed. They can never be conclusively proven wrong because they can always keep asserting that something is demonic regardless of the evidence. The rationale given for this is that demons are deceptive and have the paranormal power to manipulate reality. This is an unfalsifiable position, and the ability to create an unfalsifiable position that can't be proven wrong does not mean that they win the argument or that their position reflects reality. Adopting an unfalsifiable position ensures that a person can never win the argument in the realm of reason because what their argument relies on is irrationality. There is another similarity between prayer and sorcery. Both of them do not consistently give extremely successful results. These kind of results do happen, but they aren't very common. This creates the need to explain why Yahweh doesn't cure every illness when called upon to do so. The common explanation is essentially that Yahweh benefits from creating and continuing your suffering to reach a specific goal or larger plan. This is not a really reciprocal relationship because if you're a Christian who really loves Yahweh, then clearly he does not love you enough to remove the illness and suffering. C.S. Lewis essentially describes suffering as God's megaphone, a tool which God uses to convey a message. If God gives your child a sickness that causes them to wither away and die, clearly this describes a more mafioso message than the message of a God who truly values human life. The mistake is presupposing that God is justified in his actions on the grounds that the results are going to be good in the end. The punishment of Adam and Eve is an excellent example of why this is not true. The punishment brought them away from God, and God's judgment resulted in bad results and more suffering rather than a good outcome. Additionally, when God imposes internal conscious torment upon someone against their will, this action can never be justified on the grounds that it is being done for better results in the end. By definition, eternal suffering allows no better results in the end because eternity never ends.